Hi, everyone. It's Naomi Wolf here at DailyClout, and I'm doing something that I have been promising for a while. After almost 2.5 months of reporting on geoengineering and new technologies that are affecting the skies that many of you see and have written to us about, I want to share more consistently what I found in my reporting. It's pretty extraordinary. And this is just the beginning. This is an overview, just to give you the headlines of what we found, what I've been reporting on Twitter. Of course, Twitter is a good medium for alerting people to an issue, but not a great medium for in-depth summaries. So this is taking the confirmed material that we've documented, all from peer-reviewed sources or major news outlets, and instead of tweeting them as I learn them, or as I respond to your images, and as I research them, I'm going to do a series of videos, and this is the first one. So these are the headlines, and welcome. So what this all started with was last summer I read, because that's our mission at DailyClout, a new bill which was passed, which is a bill by Representative Zoe Lofgren called about the weather industry. And this really struck me because what is a weather industry, right? What is the weather industry? It's sort of a new coinage. In the bill, it was even more alarming or newsworthy because what I saw was that $130 million of taxpayer money was directed to unnamed weather industry private stakeholders, and specifically the research and R&D, research and development, the new technologies, the new methods, the new processes that this $130 million is going to pay for. The IP goes to these private industry stakeholders, which is kind of astonishing. It's not like the government keeps the IP and does a better job informing us about the weather, but no, all of the IP, all of the patents go to these unnamed private industry stakeholders, the weather industry. I called Representative Lofgren's office and asked her staffer, what is the weather industry? And I did not get an answer. But it's notable, as you'll understand shortly, that Representative Lofgren represents Silicon Valley. That is going to be important in a few beats. All right, so that really led me to look more carefully, how are people monetizing the weather? And the other thing that really jumped out at that bill is that oceanographic and meteorological reporting is also privatized in this bill, largely privatized. So we've seen a wave of these bills that get very little press, privatizing really important objective government functions, or functions that should be objective, like meteorology. So this bill privatized a great deal of that. So then I did more reporting, and I found out that you can bet on weather, that weather became a commodity on the Chicago Stock Exchange some decades ago. And of course, understanding how hedge funds work and how certain kinds of investment works in our economy, of course, if you can bet on a drought or bet on a great deal of rainfall, it's really important for agribusiness, it's important for Monsanto, it's also important for people who are just hedging the weather. All right, so having done this, I began to notice really dramatic changes in the skies here in New York City, starting last November. And I'm fortunate in that I'm CEO of my own company. I'm able to look outside, when I want to, and I spend time outside, and it was very remarkable that something new was in the sky. And I took a lot of pictures, and one of the things that was notable was that contrail emissions looked like tractor tracks. And I would go uptown to Harlem and see multiple contrail emissions, many more than in other parts of the city. And I began to notice that these contrail emissions behaved in a very specific way. And this sounds like science fiction, but as you're going to discover, it's not. What I saw when I looked for long enough was that the emissions didn't go away the way they had when I was a child and young adult and grown up, for decades and decades. We're all used to that. Those of us who are, older than 20-somethings, we remember how contrails used to just dissipate. You could see them and they would vanish. These contrails did not behave that way. They spread, and they, to my surprise, didn't just spread, but often they created cloud cover. And I began to notice a very distinct pattern that these emissions, these trails would, I'm not going to say be lain down because I don't know for sure what the motivation is. I've got some hypotheses, but they would clearly stay there, not dissipate, spread, and create cloud cover, and block the sun. And I was quite methodological about it, and I noticed that this took about 20 to 30 minutes on a typical day for this haze to be created, a kind of metallic silvery haze. So I began posting about this and asking about it. What is this? What's going on? I love, love, love social media and DailyClout's mission because of rigorous citizen reporting, where you can ask a question if you're a trusted person, and I hope by now I am, and say, help me understand this. And you get well-intentioned people across the country and around the world who can help you and direct you to research that you need. So I'm going to fast forward. I learned that any cirrus particulate, I beg your pardon, any particulate can become cirrus cloud. This is important. This is like the building block of what I want to explain to you. I would post these things and critics would say, well, it's just cirrus cloud. Well, I learned about clouds in elementary school and middle school and high school. And of course, cirrus is a category of cloud. But what the critics were not disclosing is that, in fact, recently it's been discovered by meteorologists that any particulate sprayed into a certain part of the sky can become cirrus cloud. So you can make cirrus clouds, and you can make it with particulate. I looked more deeply, and then I was very startled to find that when I traveled to Oregon, I saw the same tracks in a landscape that I knew very, very well, and that this was anomalous. And then when I went to Wales in March, and then north to Manchester and to the north of England, another sky I knew intimately, I was startled to see natural clouds, which by now I had educated myself. I could tell the difference between beautiful cumulus clouds and these bizarre kind of clouds that emerged from emissions, right? And I was extremely startled to see emissions underneath cumulus clouds in Chester. And then I visited friends in Wales, and pristine landscape, pristine environment. I saw emissions, vertical emissions over the sea that hadn't been there when I had visited before. And then I went to London, and I saw, even more dramatically, emissions laid down over the British Library that then spread to become what was now this characteristic silver metallic, disgusting haze. And I documented that. Well, so at this point I thought, something's happening. I know these skies. It's not the first time. I go back and forth to London. I go back and forth to the north of England. I go back and forth to Oregon. These are familiar skies. This was an anomalous situation. So I started posting about it, and then people from all over the world, but notably certain landscapes, began responding with photographs of their own, in which they sent me almost identical images. And sometimes quite identical images, and most importantly, time-lapse photography in which you could see the same dynamic. These emissions that spread, blurred, created a haze, created cloud cover, blocked the sun. And I began to notice in New York City that there would be sunny mornings, which was typical, but you would almost never get a sunny afternoon, because by mid-afternoon, there were these emissions flights and cloud cover. Well, at this point, I also began to see that there was confirmatory evidence in the independent eyewitness accounts that I was getting from across the United States. Certainly, we started with the US. So there were hotbeds of activity, independent citizens, independent eyewitnesses, sending independently confirming. And as a journalist, that's really important. They were ostensibly strangers to each other, different parts of Central Florida, but documenting the same phenomena, right? That's called confirmation in journalism. You need two independent eyewitnesses before you can have a fact. Of course, that's not the limit of your confirmation, but that's a strong indication that something real happened. So Central Florida was being bombarded with these emissions flights. Vermont and Massachusetts bombarded. Northern California absolutely crisscross bombarded with these emissions flights. We had reports from Indiana, Utah, not so much from the Midwest, some from Texas, but these hotspots in the country kept reporting day after day after day. Nevada, these identical emissions flights. And then we, began to attract a lot of interest because obviously this is something that we weren't making up. And we began to hear from people in Geneva, Spain, Valencia specifically, Scotland is being bombarded, South Central England, of course, and Ireland and Germany. So this was clearly a global phenomenon. I began to do research because I'm a reporter. And this is one of those, how can I put it? There are communities online who talk about chemtrails. I am not comfortable with that as a reporter. It's not a term I accept because we don't know what these emissions are yet. I have some good evidence, but we don't know for sure. And I couldn't align myself with these communities. I had to do my own independent research. Not that many of them aren't doing wonderful work, just that I have to start from scratch. I'm a journalist. I have to figure it out for myself, and every step of the way, I need to confirm what I may be looking at. So I'm going to fast forward and summarize. We found 4 technologies that are real, that are really happening. And I'm not making them up. I wish that I was. I wish I were wrong. Unfortunately, I'm not. One of the technologies, they all fall under the umbrella of what's called geoengineering. And geoengineering is a thing which I began to notice because the Carnegie Foundation, a heavily endowed think tank and funder, I also have to note a very corrupt one. It's headed by Richard Broadhead, who was dean at Yale, when I tried to let him know that there was sexual assault being covered up at Yale. So I don't have a lot of faith in the leadership of the Carnegie Foundation, but they've been getting a lot of press, positive press, like the New York Times last fall, to kind of introduce the idea that geoengineering could be a good idea. And I recognize, having been a political consultant, a PR campaign. And so they're definitely kind of promoting and seeding news stories in mainstream media to encourage people to get used to the idea that we have a climate crisis and the Carnegie Foundation has these technologies that could, really help us in the event that we can't stabilize climate change at a sustainable way. So now I'm going to break down the technologies. Not all of these are funded by the Carnegie Foundation. There are other funders, notably in the tech space. One of the most frightening technologies is called solar radiation management. The lead scientist for this technology is David Keith, Dr. David Keith of Harvard. Also involved is Dr. Dustin Tingley, the vice provost of Harvard. It's very, very senior people at Harvard. Dr. Gernot Wagner, also at Harvard. They have something called, they have a consortium. And the way a consortium works, it's very sneaky, or it bears more investigation. A consortium is a way to say to outsiders, well, look, these are just scientists doing research. It's just pure academic, impartial research. But the consortium is a way to keep the IP. And Harvard owns the IP of these consortia. Right? So the scientists do the research, they find the the technologies, they create the innovations. Harvard, which is, yes, an educational institution and a corporation, right, keeps the IP. So very corruptly, Harvard boasted, when I researched the Dr. Keith's group, Harvard and the vice provost were boasting in public of Harvard's power to convene, meaning Harvard's ability to bring stakeholders from around the world who are heads of governments or who are gatekeepers of environmental policies in governments around the world to learn about solar radiation management, this process whose IP and patents Harvard keeps, right? And if that isn't a conflict of interest, I have never seen or heard of a conflict of interest. So they convene stakeholders as an autonomous, independent, nominally university. Sorry. They promote this technology, and then countries adopt the technology. The UN adopts the technology as the push that they're clearly pushing. The UN is invoked in many, many scientific papers around this technology as being sort of the ideal gatekeeper for the technology. And then Harvard gets to profit every time this technology is purchased, used, bought. Now let me tell you about the technology. There is an experiment, and even people who are in the environmental space in Arizona are not familiar with this experiment. They've kept it well under wraps. It's called SCOPEX, SCOPEX. David Keith, Gernot Wagner, Dustin Tingley are slated to perform this experiment right now. It was supposed to have started in 2017, go into 2018. David Keith insists he hasn't started it yet, but it is ready to go if it's not underway, and he won't directly say when it will be released. This experiment, this technology releases unnamed particulates. On the record, Dr. Keith has mentioned sulfates, which is pollution, right? Or alumina, his words, right? Particulate made of aluminum, as two of the possible kinds of particulate that they're going to be releasing. They won't say how much they're releasing, but the way SRM works is it creates what these scientists call, I kid you not, a sunshade world. They want a sunshade world to artificially block the sun's rays, right? To dim the planet, right? To artificially stabilize global warming so that global warming is artificially stabilized. Well, you may think that's a good idea. I think it's a terrifying idea. But what they don't disclose that readily in the PR, it's certainly not forefront in what people are invited to learn in their FAQs on Harvard's website, is that you have to keep doing this forever once you start. You have to keep doing it forever once you start, or else if you stop, the planet faces quote unquote catastrophic warming. Okay, so just wrap your brain around that. They start releasing these particulates in the air. They won't say how much. They won't say exactly what. It could be alumina, which has been linked to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, right? Allergies, asthmas, right? We have so many reactions to particulates that are already in the air. But aluminum is dangerous. It's OSHA says you have to take many, many precautions even being around alumina, let alone powdered aluminum that will enter our waterways, our land, our breathing, our bodies, our brains, right? Linked to serious health disorders. Or sulfates, which are also dangerous, also linked to allergies, asthma, respiratory issues, right? Also extremely dangerous to breathe. So that's what they want to do. I asked Dr. Keith, and by the way, a geoengineering industry website which reported on this project or this experiment says that they've raised $7 million out of a $20 million raise. The guys who are invested are hedge fund guys and venture capitalists. It is not like independent scientific research. And Bill Gates. And Bill Gates is also a partner or invested in another one of David Keith's businesses, a private company called Carbon Engineering. So notably, the other guy who is a partner and investor in Carbon Engineering is one of Canada's biggest fossil fuels magnates. So when you think through what is the purpose of a sunshade world, why would anyone think this is a good idea? Especially since the geoengineering industry website said that the environmental and health effects are unknown, or rather the environmental effects are unknown. Certainly the health effects are unknown because it's never happened before, right? So this is so unprecedented, so dangerous, such a dramatically rash idea, right? They don't know what will happen. One of the climate scientists that one of the news articles about this interviewed said, well, we don't know. They don't know what could happen. They could burn off more of the ozone layer, right? A JetBlue pilot I asked about this was astonished when I described what they're planning, and he said, don't these fools know that tropospheric winds spread for 2,000 miles? So you don't have to be in Arizona to be experimented on by the Keith group or by Dr. Keith's group and Harvard. Harvard is experimenting on everyone within the flight path of this undisclosed experiment called ScopeX. I want to tell you a couple of other very disturbing things. Dr. Keith did come on. I solicited very courteously an interview with Dr. Keith, Dr. Wagner, Dr. Tingley. Ironically, weather kept me from traveling to Harvard the day that we were slated to do it. I've been trying to be fair and sit with these scientists and this vice provost of Harvard and ask them direct questions about ScopeX. They won't sit with me. They won't reschedule. Periodically, they come on the Twitter feed, which is kind of an honor, to make fun of citizens who are trying to understand geoengineering and what they see in the skies. I think this is unfortunate because scientists, especially who take public money, as Harvard does, as this, in fact, this research took $100,000 in public money. I certainly think scientists should be answerable to ordinary citizens and have some respect for ordinary citizens, for lay people, not mock them, not condescend to them, especially since they're experimenting on American citizens. I want to say a couple more things about ScopeX, and then I'll wrap up that technology and pick up again tomorrow with the other three technologies. It is actually illegal to experiment on human beings without their consent in the United States. It's actually international law as well. You need to have informed consent to experiment on human beings. And what informed consent means, and I've written about this, I wrote about it in The Beauty Myth, is that people need to know before you can experiment on them and before they can truly consent. They have to be adults. They have to be sane. They can't be, mentally in an institution unable to think, make up their own minds. And they have to be told what the risks are that they might be running. And then they have to consent, and they have to sign a document saying that they consent. That's what informed consent is. Harvard's own medical ethics guidelines for experimentation forbid the kind of experimentation on human beings that ScopeX represents. The people of Arizona, and I'm hearing from them, a number of people in my Twitter feed and our DailyClout community are based in Arizona. They're taking pictures of their sky. The sky is white in an aberrant kind of way. It's boiling over. It looks extremely unusual and unnatural. I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to characterize it beyond saying these are people who've lived in Arizona for decades, and they're saying, we've never seen the sky look like this. Dr. Keith won't answer. Gernot Wagner won't answer when I ask them directly. Molly Icewater lives in Arizona. Here's a photograph of the sky outside her house. She's asking, is this ScopeX? They won't answer. So I just want to note that it is illegal to experiment on the people of Arizona. It's illegal to experiment on me. It's illegal to experiment on you. And we are all potentially in the flight path of ScopeX. The other thing I really want to note is that I asked Dr. Keith directly about what governance oversees this experiment, because I thought this is so rash. Rich guys playing with the environment for their own benefit. their own profit, and not even disclosing it to the rest of us. There's a lot that has fallen by the wayside in terms of regulations under this EPA, this FAA, but I could not understand how an experiment like this was legal, which has literally no way to, we have no way to know what will happen to the sky or the planet if they go ahead and release these weather balloons with this particulate, including alumina, all over our troposphere, our stratosphere. So when I asked Dr. Keith directly, he said, it's complicated. Well, governance isn't that complicated, and I'm not an idiot, and neither are you. So I pressed, and I said, what is it? What is it? What governance? He wouldn't answer. In my own research with the geoengineering industry website, it turns out that the governance is, and I've asked him to correct me if this is wrong, but he has not corrected it, an Indian reservation. They're launching from an Indian reservation. Why is that important? Indian reservations have different laws than the rest of the United States. In some ways, they're exempt from the laws that govern the United States, which is why, really wonderful things happen on Indian reservations. Some very not great things can happen on Indian reservations because people who are trying to evade the law often use Indian reservations or can use them as a way to conceal or get away with what would be illegal under United States jurisdictions. So this experiment is illegal in the rest of the United States. It's illegal in other parts of the world. They're experimenting on human beings, and they are evidently, according to a geoengineering website, it is so illegal that they have to launch this weather balloon to release these unnamed particulates in unnamed amounts to unnamed effect that could shield the sun forever. They're doing it from an Indian reservation. I've been speaking for almost half an hour, so I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say, I want to draw, just with this one technology, a kind of political conclusion. Why would anyone think it's a good idea, right? Why would anyone think a sunshade world in which, as Dr. Keith himself said, 10,000 people could die from the increased particulates in the air, but a world in which you do not see the sun, no blue skies, right? When Dr. Keith speaks, he has an emblem that shows the sunshade world, a kind of cartoon, and it's surrounded by this white. And people are reporting this all over America, a kind of white shell or white covering that blocks the sun. Why would anyone think that's a good idea? Well, it was very instructive to me to notice that one of his partners is a fossil fuel guy. Because think about it, if you're the fossil fuel industry and solar is getting cheaper and cheaper, solar is getting more and more effective, more and more nations are trying to shift to alternative fuel, especially solar, a sunshade world in which there's a white haze or particulate that blocks the sun forever, or you can hold the world hostage. You can't stop doing it or else there's catastrophic warming. It kind of makes sense. It's kind of attractive because you can say, well, we're doing this because of global warming, and look, this stabilizes temperatures. But it's really a Band-Aid that cuts solar off at the knees, right? Cuts the solar industry off at the knees. And Hector is saying, there it is, that's right. It keeps you from being outmaneuvered by your sustainable competitors, the solar industry. It keeps people from freaking out enough about rising temperatures to demand action and a solar grid or an alternative grid from their governments. And it gives the fossil fuel industry an extra 20 or 30 years of Band-Aid to use up fossil fuels and keep having those positive quarterly reports for their shareholders. So that's just my hypothesis about why there's such a push for solar radiation management from these stakeholders that include, sadly, big oil, big fracking, fossil fuel industry. That's it for me. I finally shared with all of you some of what I've been researching. The other 3 technologies we're going to talk about in upcoming broadcasts are cloud seeding, much more widespread than has been reported, much more destructive. Marine cloud brightening, Bill Gates is also an investor in that, also very, very dangerous and destructive to our planet. And aerosol programs, where the Department of Energy, for instance, is aerosolizing, sending flights to lay down aerosol emissions. I need to do more reporting on that, but these are major industries: cloud seeding, solar radiation management, marine cloud brightening, and aerosol programs. And we will continue to look at this, and finally biofuels. Biofuels may be having unintended effects that we may be seeing in our skies. So that's it for me. Please support DailyClout. It takes resources to report out these important stories that you don't always get with the fossil fuel funded mainstream news media. And I'll look forward to hearing your questions and answering your questions and taking on your observations. In our next meeting, I'll post the time on Twitter and on Facebook. Again, it's Naomi Wolf. I'm CEO of DailyClout, and today we were talking about ScopeX, or solar radiation management. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching.